There are stories that history tried to bury, cases that governments sealed and stamped classified, events that witnesses carried in silence to their graves, mysteries that science approaches carefully and then sometimes steps back from without a clean answer. You've found the place where those stories live. Welcome to Scary Radio. Every episode, we go deeper into the cases that don't resolve neatly, the unexplained encounters, the cursed discoveries, the incidents that official records acknowledge just enough to make you uncomfortable. We follow the evidence wherever it leads, and sometimes it leads somewhere the daylight doesn't reach. If this is your first time here, welcome. Stay a while. There's a lot of dark to explore. If you've been here before, you already know what this place is. Subscribe to Scary Radio wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us so you never miss an episode. Now, let's begin. Egypt, November 1922. The Valley of the Kings had been picked over for decades. Tomb robbers had worked it for centuries before that. Long before European archaeologists arrived with their notebooks and their ambitions, local men had been threading through the limestone corridors of the valley's hidden chambers, pulling out whatever could be carried and sold. By the early 20th century, most serious Egyptologists had reached a consensus. The valley was finished. The great pharaohs of the New Kingdom had been found, catalogued, removed, and studied. Whatever the ancient thieves had missed, the modern excavators had recovered. There was nothing left beneath that pale, heat-blasted rock. Howard Carter disagreed. Carter was a British archaeologist, largely self-taught. He had started his Egyptian career as a tracer of hieroglyphs and a copyist of tomb paintings, working with his hands before he ever worked with theory. That practical foundation gave him something that university-trained scholars sometimes lacked. He understood the valley not as an abstraction or a problem to be solved from a library, but as a physical place with specific geography, specific geology, specific patterns in the way sediment moved and accumulated over centuries. He had walked every inch of it. He had studied the old maps, cross-referenced the known tomb locations, and identified a section of the valley floor that, in his estimation, had never been properly excavated. He was stubborn about it in the way that only certain kinds of brilliant people can sustain being stubborn, quietly, persistently, without drama, year after year. He believed one tomb remained, a minor king, a boy who had ruled briefly during one of the most convulsive periods in Egyptian history, during the long shadow cast by the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, and who had died young enough and been erased thoroughly enough that his name had been chiseled from monument walls and struck from the official king lists. 3,000 years of deliberate forgetting. Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, dead at approximately 19, gone from the record for 32 centuries. Carter had a patron in Lord Carnarvon, a wealthy English aristocrat whose interest in Egyptian antiquities was genuine rather than performative, but whose patience with empty seasons and empty trenches had its limits. Carnarvon had been funding Carter's work for years. By 1922, the ledger was not inspiring. He summoned Carter and delivered what amounted to an ultimatum. One more season. One final funded excavation. If nothing was found, that was the end of it. Carter returned to the valley in the first days of November with a workforce of Egyptian laborers and began clearing debris from a section of the valley floor beneath the remains of ancient workmen's huts. Huts that previous excavators had left undisturbed out of respect for their historical interest, and which Carter had always suspected were sitting directly above something important. On the 4th of November, a young water boy working at the base of the clearing struck something solid beneath the sand with a digging stick. He called for the foreman. The foreman called for Carter. A stone step. They kept digging. Another step appeared beneath the first, then another. By the end of the day, 16 steps had been uncovered, leading down at a steep angle to a sealed doorway plastered with the unmistakable impressions of the royal necropolis seals. Carter examined the door carefully. It had been breached in antiquity, opened, partially resealed, opened again, resealed a second time, but it was fundamentally intact. Whatever was behind it had survived. He made the decision not to open it alone. He had the staircase recovered with debris to protect it and sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. The message was restrained in its wording and enormous in its implication. At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. Carnarvon arrived 3 weeks later. On the evening of November 26th, Carter made a small breach in the upper left corner of the doorway, inserted a candle, and looked inside. The air that came out was stale and ancient and warm, the breath of a sealed room held shut for 32 centuries, finally exhaled. Carter held the candle higher and his eyes adjusted to the dark. Gold. Everywhere. Heaped and piled and stacked and arranged in overwhelming, impossible abundance. Gilded furniture. Painted chariots. Alabaster vessels, statues of black and gold standing sentinel. An entire civilization's worth of the most precious objects its craftsmen had ever produced, left undisturbed in total darkness since roughly 1323 BC. Carnarvon, standing directly behind him at the breach, asked quietly whether he could see anything. Carter took a long moment before he answered. Yes, he said, wonderful things. The warning and the dead. The world celebrated the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb with the kind of breathless, collective excitement that only comes once or twice in a generation. Newspapers ran the story on their front pages for weeks. The treasures being cataloged and photographed inside that sealed chamber were described in language usually reserved for mythology. It was the find of the century, possibly the find of any century. And then Lord Carnarvon died. April 5th, 1923. Less than 5 months after the tomb was opened. He was 57 years old. The sequence of events leading to his death was medically unremarkable, which made it no less final. A mosquito bite on his left cheek became infected after he nicked it while shaving. The infection spread into his blood. The blood poisoning weakened a respiratory system already compromised by a serious automobile accident he had suffered years earlier, an accident that had left his lungs fragile and his constitution perpetually vulnerable to illness. Pneumonia set in. Within days, one of the most prominent figures in the greatest archaeological discovery in modern history was gone. The press did not treat it as bad luck. The press treated it as confirmation. Someone, and historians have never conclusively established who, produced an inscription allegedly found within the tomb. The words were simple, declarative, and devastating in their timing. Death shall come on swift wings to him that toucheth the tomb of the pharaoh. Egyptologists searched the tomb walls methodically. No such inscription was ever found. The text could not be verified, could not be sourced, could not be traced to any documented wall, doorway, or artifact within the burial chamber. It was almost certainly invented. It didn't matter. The quote traveled around the world at the speed of the telegraph and embedded itself in the public imagination with the permanence of something genuinely ancient. Within weeks, it was being treated as established fact. Within months, it was the foundation of an entire mythology, and then the deaths kept coming. Arthur Mace, one of Carter's most trusted excavation team members, began declining in health not long after working in the tomb. He suffered from deepening exhaustion and physical collapse that never resolved. He died in 1928, his body having simply given out. George J. Gould, an American railway magnate who visited the tomb as a celebrated guest, developed a fever shortly afterward and was dead within months. Lord Carnarvon's own half-brother, Aubrey Herbert, died in September of 1923, the same year as Carnarvon himself, adding a family dimension to the growing list that journalists found impossible to resist. A radiologist named Archibald Reed, brought specifically to Egypt to x-ray royal mummies, died suddenly. Sir Lee Stack, who had visited the tomb site, was assassinated in Cairo in 1924. A political killing with nothing to do with archaeology, but his name was added to the tally regardless. The list grew with each passing year, absorbing deaths that had tangential connections, peripheral associations, the loosest possible links to the original excavation. By the end of the decade, depending on who was counting and how generously they defined involvement, the curse had claimed anywhere from a dozen to more than 20 lives. Howard Carter, the man who had actually opened the tomb, who had been first through the doorway, who had handled the artifacts, who had spent years working inside that chamber, Carter lived until 1939. 17 years after the discovery, he died at 64 of lymphoma, old by the standards of his era. He called the curse sensational nonsense until the day he died. He wasn't wrong, but he was also by then completely alone in saying so. What science says. Science took its time arriving at the curse of Tutankhamun. For decades, the deaths were filed under coincidence, the inscription under fabrication, and the entire mythology under the broad category of public hysteria. Serious researchers didn't engage with it directly because engaging with it directly felt like lending it credibility it didn't deserve. But eventually, the questions became too persistent to ignore. And when scientists finally looked closely, really closely, with modern tools and genuine rigor, what they found was not nothing. The first and most compelling biological argument centers on what was sealed inside that tomb for 3,000 years. Ancient Egyptian burial chambers are not sterile environments. They are closed, organic, humid spaces containing enormous quantities of decomposing biological material, food offerings left for the afterlife, flower garlands, wooden furniture, linen wrappings, resins, oils, and of course, human remains in various stages of preservation. Over millennia, these materials become complex ecosystems. Bacteria, molds, and fungi establish themselves, reproduce, and in the absence of fresh oxygen and light, settle into states of extreme dormancy, suspended, waiting, essentially frozen in biological time. When Howard Carter breached that doorway in November 1922, 3,000 years of accumulated dormancy ended in an instant. Fresh oxygen flooded the chamber, and whatever had been waiting in the walls, the artifacts, and the air of that sealed space became suddenly dangerously active again. Researchers examining Tutankhamun's tomb have identified spores of Aspergillus niger and Aspergillus flavus on the chamber walls. These are not obscure laboratory curiosities. They are molds capable of causing serious respiratory infections in healthy people and genuinely lethal illness in those whose immune systems are already weakened or compromised. They produce toxic compounds. They attack lung tissue. In the right host, under the right conditions, they can kill. Lord Carnarvon had chronically damaged lungs. His respiratory system had been permanently weakened by his automobile accident years before he ever set foot in Egypt. He was precisely the kind of person for whom a concentrated exposure to ancient mold spores, inhaled in an enclosed, unventilated space during the initial opening, could push an existing vulnerability past the point of recovery. His death, viewed through this lens, becomes less mysterious and more medically coherent than the curse narrative ever allowed. Beyond mold, researchers have pointed to other potential hazards sealed within ancient tombs. Bat colonies have been found in various burial sites across Egypt, and bats carry pathogens. Certain chemical compounds used extensively in the mummification process, natron salts, cedar resins, bituminous substances, can be caustic and chemically toxic in high concentrations within an unventilated space. The tomb, in short, was not just a room. It was a sealed biological and chemical environment that had been accumulating hazardous material for 32 centuries. Then there is the statistical argument, which is blunter but equally important. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was the most celebrated archaeological event of the 20th century. It attracted an enormous number of visitors: scientists, journalists, aristocrats, diplomats, dignitaries, and curious civilians in the years following the opening. When you track a large, aging, demographically privileged population over 10 to 20 years, deaths occur. They occur at the rate that actuarial tables predict and human biology produces. Multiple researchers have run the numbers. The mortality rate among people associated with the tomb was not statistically elevated above what you would expect from a comparable group of people of similar age and background. The curse's body count was real only if you counted selectively, stretched the definition of association to its breaking point, and quietly ignored the far greater number of people who entered that tomb and died years later, peacefully in their beds of nothing more sinister than old age. The boy king himself. It is easy, inside the enormous machinery of the curse narrative, to lose sight of the actual human being at the center of it. The gold, the mythology, the deaths, the headline lines, they have a way of consuming everything. But Tutankhamun was a person before he was a legend, a child specifically, and his story, stripped of every supernatural layer, is one of the most genuinely tragic in the ancient world. He came to the throne at approximately 8 or 9 years old. The Egypt he inherited was in crisis. His father, almost certainly Akhenaten, history's great religious radical, had spent his reign dismantling 3,000 years of Egyptian theological tradition. The old gods had been abolished, their temples shuttered, their priesthoods stripped of wealth, authority, and purpose. The sprawling, intricate religious ecosystem that had sustained Egyptian civilization since its earliest dynasties had been swept away and replaced with the worship of a single solar deity, the Aten, whose earthly representative was Akhenaten himself. It was one of the most audacious acts of cultural revolution the ancient world ever produced. It was also, by the time Akhenaten died, a catastrophe. The priesthood of Amun, the most powerful religious institution in Egypt, had been humiliated. The military had been neglected. The diplomatic correspondence of the period, preserved in a cache of clay tablets known as the Amarna letters, shows Egypt's foreign allies growing increasingly desperate as the pharaoh ignored their appeals for military support, absorbed in his theological project. Into this wreckage stepped a child, guided by two powerful men, the court official A, who served as a kind of regent, and the military commander Horemheb, who had maintained the army through the chaos of Akhenaten's reign. The young king set about reversing everything his father had done. The temples were reopened. The old gods were restored to their places. The priesthood of Amun was returned its wealth and its authority. As a public declaration of where his loyalties lay, the boy king changed his own name from Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten, Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. He ruled for approximately 9 years. Then he died and left no surviving heirs. Modern analysis of his mummified remains has painted a picture of a young man carrying an almost improbable physical burden: a clubfoot, a cleft palate, bone disease affecting multiple parts of his skeleton, evidence of at least 2 separate malaria infections, possibly more, a fracture in his left leg, sustained close to the time of death, that may have become infected and overwhelmed a body already weakened by accumulated illness. He was not a healthy child who died suddenly. He was a fragile young man who had been fighting his own biology for most of his short life. He was 19 years old when that fight ended. What followed was deliberate erasure. And then Horemheb took the throne in succession, and one or both of them made a systematic effort to remove Tutankhamun from the historical record entirely. His name was chiseled from monument walls. His images were appropriated and recarved with other faces. His cartouche was struck from the king lists that Egyptian scribes used to track the succession of rulers. The explicit goal was to make it appear to history that he had never existed at all. For 3,000 years, it worked. Then a stone step appeared beneath the sand of the Valley of the Kings, and the most successfully forgotten pharaoh in Egyptian history became the most famous one who ever lived. The men who buried him made him immortal. The curse that wouldn't die. The curse of Tutankhamun has now outlived everyone who was present when the tomb was opened. It has outlived the Egypt in which Howard Carter worked. It has outlived the British Empire that funded the excavation. It has survived scientific debunking, statistical analysis, and over a century of serious archaeological scholarship, patiently explaining in precise and well-documented detail why it isn't real. And yet here it is, still breathing, still circulating, still attaching itself to new misfortunes, new coincidences, new deaths that feel in the telling, in the dark, at the right angle, too deliberate to be random. Why won't it die? Part of the answer belongs to timing. The discovery landed in 1922, just 4 years after the end of the First World War. The civilizations of Europe had watched their rational, industrialized, scientifically confident societies produce the most systematic slaughter in human history. The faith in progress, in the idea that reason and technology pointed reliably upward toward something better, had been buried in the mud of the Somme alongside millions of young men. People were looking, consciously or not, for something that existed outside the rational framework that had so catastrophically failed them. Spiritualism was flourishing. The boundaries between the living and the dead felt to enormous numbers of grieving people genuinely permeable. The curse of Tutankhamun arrived into that hunger and fed it perfectly. But cultural timing only explains so much. The deeper answer runs older than 1922. Older than archaeology, older than Egypt itself. Human beings have always understood at some level that precedes language and logic that the dead are not entirely gone. That burial is not simply disposal, that the rituals performed over a body, the prayers, the offerings, the careful arrangements, the sealing of the tomb, represent a contract of some kind between the living and whatever comes after. Every culture in recorded history has had versions of this understanding. Most of them have also had versions of the warning: disturb the dead at your peril. Cross that threshold uninvited and accept the consequences. The Egyptians built an entire civilization on this premise. Their tombs were not storage rooms. They were architectural theology, precise, elaborate, enormously expensive statements about the nature of death and what lay beyond it. The priests who prepared Tutankhamun's body, who arranged his treasures, who sealed that doorway and walked away, believed with complete conviction that they were sending a human soul into an eternal existence that required protection, provision, and above all, undisturbed peace. When Carter's candle broke the darkness of that chamber in November 1922, it wasn't just a room being opened, it was a boundary being crossed. And some part of the human mind, the ancient part, the part that still dreams and still fears and still listens for things moving in the dark, recognized that crossing and recorded it as transgression. Science can explain the mold spores. Statistics can explain the deaths. Logic can dismantle every link in the curse's chain and leave nothing standing. But Tutankhamun's gold is still in Cairo. His mummy still lies in the valley where Carter found it. And the curse, fabricated, sensationalized, statistically indefensible, scientifically implausible, is still alive in the imagination of every person who has ever stood in front of his golden mask and felt, just for a moment, something they couldn't name. The boy king wanted only to be left alone in the dark. 3,000 years later, the whole world knows his name. Perhaps that is the real curse. Not death, not illness, just the impossibility, after all this time, of being forgotten.